And we are live. Good morning. It's Garland Nixon, and I've got some great guests today on a Saturday morning. We're going to talk with Regis Tremblay out of the Crimea. We're going to talk with Dan Lazar. We're going to talk with Dr. Gerald Horne and hang out with you. Let's talk. Good morning there, my friends. Saturday morning here in Maryland on the beautiful shores of the Chesapeake Bay, just outside of Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Annapolis. And hopefully we'll have a fun broadcast and maybe we will even learn something. Good morning, Regis, and welcome to Maryland.
Thank you, Garland. It's always good to be with you.
So let's do this. I want to try to get an idea. You are in Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula. You're actually in the Russian Federation, and we get a lot of discussion here about the entire to hear it now. I actually I have a other radio shows besides my Sputnik show. And the one I have in Washington, D.C., a caller asked me, if Putin's so right, then why does he have to oppress all of his people and shut off all the media and convince his people that he's right? In other words, the argument is that the Russian people are all opposed to Vladimir Putin, and he's making the dictatorial move. Give me your perspective from Russia. What's the reality?
Yeah, that's totally out of place. It's unreal. It's fabricated BS. A poll was taken last week by an independent polling firm that has done a number of polls in Russia. Putin's approval rating is at 77% approval rating. Before February 4th, his approval rating, February 24th, when the Russian initiative in Ukraine began, his approval rating was down in the mid 60s to maybe high 60s. And in this past month, it's risen to 77%. You can put that in the bank.
Well, let me ask you this, because, that's what I suspected. I've been following the approval ratings. That's one of the things I try to do as best I can to find out what the approval rating is of various leaders in other countries, because, we're consistently told that countries are evil dictators. And when I woke up was when I went to Venezuela, and I was told that Nicolas Maduro was an evil dictator and his people hated him. And I went around the country and they loved the ground that he walked on. I mean, overwhelmingly. And part of it was this too. There, and that was they saw the West as an enemy, and they saw the U.S. empire as an enemy, and they saw him as fighting on their side. What are the dynamics in Russia? So we can understand it. But one of the things I saw, it said his approval ratings are the highest they've been since he brought the Crimea back into Russia in 2014. So again, pushing against the U.S. narrative. What are the dynamics we need to know about what people want from Vladimir Putin in Russia, and why these things affect his approval ratings?
Well, the first thing I want to say is there are many thousands of people in Russia who oppose war, oppose this war, just as there are many thousands or millions of people in America who oppose war, who oppose the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the war in Iraq. So I want to put that on the table. Not all Russians are bloodthirsty tyrants. They're very peaceful people. The second thing that I want to say about the feeling on the ground is it's different in Russia than it is in Crimea. Mm-hmm. Russia, people in Russia, unlike the people in Crimea, which was part of Ukraine since Khrushchev deeded it to Kiev, there was intermarriage for decades. These people are blood related. They're people who are on both sides of the border, who have family, immediate family, and relatives and friends. And the mood here in Crimea is somewhat somber. Everybody is talking about it. I was in a cab the other day, and the cab driver said, "Oh boy, war is bad. I don't like what Putin did, but I'm from Donetsk, and I know that it's important to keep the people in Donetsk free from these daily bombardments." So that's kind of the mood on the ground. It's very somber here in the Crimea, but I think it's very different in Moscow, Petersburg, and other parts of Russia.
So also the sanctions, one of the things the neocons seem to have believed was that if they instituted these sanctions within 2 weeks, I haven't heard this, within 2 weeks, Russia's entire economy will collapse. And I argued that, well, I think they'll go through some difficult times, but they produce their own food and a lot of their own products. And I think they've made it through hard times before. I think Russia makes it through this. You talk about, the difficulties, and are the shelves empty? Or people wandering around like zombies chewing on each other? What's the situation?
Oh, I have to laugh. First of all, the sanctions. There's two parts to the sanctions. In 2014, after the Crimea returned to Russia, where it has belonged since the time of the American Revolution, Catherine the Great, 1776, more or less, the people in Crimea have gotten used to the sanctions. We have recovered, we have rebounded, and the economy is bustling thanks to the help of the Russian Federation, the investment in infrastructure, the investment in tourism, the investment in building that bridge, which now is land bridge between the Russian mainland and Crimea. So we're not feeling the pain so much. Is the price of food and just about everything went up 20 to 30%. It was somewhat of a sticker shock when we went shopping. And we don't shop in the grocery stores. We shop at an outdoor, very large market. Everything had increased. I was in a chain superstore today, and I was picking up a few things. I don't go there very often, but I walked up and down all the aisles. The shelves are filled with food. And from what I hear, it's the same thing in Moscow, Petersburg, Krasnodar, throughout Russia. There's no lack, there's no shortage of food. There was a run on sugar last week, and people went out and cleaned up the shelves in Moscow anyway. I didn't see that here in Crimea. And then had expected when things improved a little bit, they would sell this sugar on the black market for 2 or 3 times the cost of what they bought it for. There's no shortages of food. The sanctions are going to hurt. I mean, when you raise the prices 20 or 30% in a couple of days, there's going to be a lot of people, they're going to have a hard time buying food.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of people having a hard time buying anything when their incomes here are much, much lower than they are in Europe or in the United States, and especially pensioners, older people, who I think are going to have a terribly hard time. And that's the point of sanctions. They don't hurt the wealthy people. They don't hurt the middle class that bad, but they're absolutely devastating. And they actually do kill poor people and children.
So, there's big talk about the information war. My belief is this: the information war, I don't put as much into it as a lot of people, because I'm in the media and I see this. It can change on a dime. So there's all the information war is not important. If there's a war, what's important is what's happening on the ground. If there's a fight between two people, well, it doesn't matter who you said win. At the end, one guy's laying on the ground and the other guy's walking away. What are your thoughts on how this in the next couple months, once the dust settles? Because I suspect that based on what's happening, that within another month, say by the end of April or May, most of this operation is going to, I may be wrong, but most of this operation is going to come to a close. What are your thoughts on how things progress once we get towards the end of the military operation?
Well, right now, there are two very divergent, different narratives. The collective West, Russia has failed. Russian troops have lost terribly, badly. Russia is now retreating and only now going to try to save the Donbass.
Actually, I think the Azov Battalion has Moscow surrounded, and they're going to plant their Wolf's Angel flag on the Kremlin any day now.
Now, the Azov Battalion in Mariupol is completely surrounded. They have a choice. You can lay down your arms or you're going to die. And they are surrounded as they retreated into a very large steel mill, completely surrounded. The city is completely surrounded, and the city is liberated except for this part. They will be destroyed in the next day or two. Everybody here who is observing what's going on the ground, even some very high-ranking people, believe that that's the case. The Azov Battalion in Mariupol is finished. Now, the Russian narrative, and I'm going to read this for you because this was really unusual. This General Sergei Rudskoy, he's been giving daily reports from the Russian Defense Ministry, and this is what he reported yesterday in a rare update on combat losses. Russia has not talked about this ever. Rudskoy announced that 1,351 Russian servicemen have died in hostilities, and another 3,800 have been injured. And he is claiming that the Ukrainians have lost 30,000, both killed and injured and wounded. The Ukrainians are giving a totally different account. They're almost flipping the coin and saying, this is how many Russians have died, 30,000. We've destroyed all their tanks. Well, the fact of the matter is, in the latest report from the same colonel, all 24 formations of the land forces of Ukraine that existed before the start of the operation suffered significant losses, and Ukraine has no organized reserves left. The Ukrainian army is no longer able to function as a military. Their communication centers have been destroyed. Command centers have been destroyed. Their supply depots, fuel depots, radar, all have been destroyed. They are not able to provide the supplies and the reinforcements that are needed now for these isolated pockets that are surrounded by the Russian military. So what the Russian military said last night is phase one of this operation has been completed. The Americans and the combined West are saying Russia failed. The Russian first objective was to demilitarize Ukraine, the army, and they are no longer a functioning army. What Russia is doing now, it has the Nazis in Mariupol totally surrounded, and they will soon be destroyed. They're now moving forces along the border of the Donbass. It's a long border to wipe out the Ukrainian forces and the neo-Nazi battalions that are very deeply entrenched, fortified, as they've been doing for 8 years. So it's very difficult for the Russian military to take them out. They are beginning to do it with incredibly accurate missile strikes. And it will not be very long before the Donbass is completely free of being bombarded every single day. Now, you asked the question, where is this going to be in 10 days or in a month? Boy, that's anybody's guess. But here's what I think. The American narrative is, oh, they failed, so they can't take Kiev and they can't take Odessa. They're just waiting. Both of those cities, major cities, Odessa, a seaport in the Black Sea, Kiev, the capital, are surrounded, except for humanitarian corridors. The Russian military is digging in and just waiting. And I think what the Russian objective is to make sure that the Donbass is free of being bombarded and people being killed on a daily basis. They've reclaimed a lot of territory, and now they will continue to fortify their own positions, and they will wait to see what's going to happen in Odessa and in Kiev, whether or not the forces that are there will realize they're finished and surrender, or unfortunately, the Russians are going to have to go in and it'll be street fighting, door to door. That is not going to be a pleasant scenario.
You know, what are your thoughts on the how the Russian people are reacting to the, this what seems to be almost a racial hatred of Russians in the West? This, obscene propaganda, let's take their money. They can't sing with us, dance with us. They can't direct orchestras. What's the reaction to the Russian people of that, of that?
The reaction that I've seen so far here in Crimea is what I explained in the beginning of the show. They're really concerned about their friends and relatives. It's something that dominates their thinking day and night. Many people are having a hard time sleeping. The Russians feel very safe, same as Crimea. They feel very safe and very well protected by their country, by their military. And I believe we are very, very safe. I think Russians, Garland, are going about their daily lives doing what they always do. Their theater is alive and well here in Crimea, in Yalta. Every single night at a large theater, there's a different group or a different person entertaining. The movie theaters are going. Everything is going. The palaces are all open. And I'm sure the same thing is the case in Moscow, because I don't hear anything different. They're going on and living life as they normally do. The only thing they're feeling is the pinch at the supermarket and the different commodities that they rely on to live a normal life. That's the way it is here right now.
I hear that the ruble has been introduced in the Kherson region, that the Mariupol may be part of the what may be the new eastern region of Ukraine or of Russia, whatever. How do you see or do you have an idea, a thought of what the realignment of Ukraine will look like?
Boy, everybody's speculating about that. And there are a number of different views.
And we got about 1 or 2 minutes because our next guest is standing by.
Yeah. One of the views is that Russia is going to take back all of the territory that was seized from the Donbass republics. Goes all the way down to Mariupol in the sea, and it goes all the way in the other direction. I forget the name of the city. That's one thought. The other thought is that Russia is going to leave Ukraine intact, will make sure that a new government is created and a new constitution is written declaring Ukraine's neutrality and the outlawing of the Nazi movement in Ukraine. If I were to speculate, I think that what Russia is going to do is what I just mentioned. Ukrainian sovereignty and neutrality will be established. Ukraine will formally recognize in their constitution the two independent republics of Donbass and Lugansk, and they will be forced to admit the independence and the return of Crimea to Russia. I think that's all that the Russian Federation wants out of this.
I think I kind of lean towards your evaluation too. Well, thanks a lot, Regis Tremblay. Don't forget, everyone, Regis Tremblay has a great YouTube show. So I'd like to ask all my subscribers, make sure you go over to Regis's show and subscribe there. It's excellent. And watch out for us on other platforms. I'm on Odyssey now because the way things are going, we never know what turn this is going to take. Thanks a lot, Regis. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Garland.
All righty. Coming up next, the one and only Dan Lazare. Oh my gosh, Dan, great to see you, my friend. How are
Good to
you?
see you in the
Great to catch
flesh.
up. Yes, yes, great to catch up with you on a Saturday morning. We're just talking to Regis from Crimea. That was an excellent discussion, of course. So, Dan, let's talk about. Let me ask you this before I say anything. What do you think if I said to Dan Lazar, the big story that we got to talk about today, that we have to start off with regarding the the Ukraine crisis, the big story, what would you call it?
I would call it the fading optimism on NATO's part regarding the progress the Ukraine is making in this war. There's a new tone has crept into the press reports in the last day or two, indicating some greater skepticism about the Kiev government's claims about all the territory they're taking, the machinery they're destroying, et cetera, and a sense that these starry-eyed reports don't really entirely add up. The Russians are making steady progress in the Donbass area and around Mariupol, where they obviously their hold is conclusive, and that's where things stand. So clearly they're in for a long slog. Russia, I'm confident, will prevail on the battlefield, if only due to their great advantage in numbers and equipment, etc. And that realization is beginning to dawn on the West, I think.
Yes, I think there's two things here. Again, Jens Stoltenberg came out and said, we're not sending any troops to NATO. I mean, excuse me, any NATO troops to Ukraine. Joe Biden has said many times, no, we don't want World War III. We don't want war with Russia. And when Jens Stoltenberg said that, he specifically said, we don't want war with Russia. There are those of us, you and I, who have had, long-standing fears, and by long-standing, I mean since the beginning of the war, that this thing could creep out a little wider, but that does run contrary to the neocon plan here, which is to suck Russia, as they saw, this will be Russia's Afghanistan. They'll suck Russia in and they will pump it full of weapons, et cetera, which the dynamics are very different here. But anyway, your thoughts on going from our initial fears that this could spread into a wider war and that NATO could get sucked into it, the way things are looking now, the dynamics, where are you now? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I mean, I think I still lay odds. I think the odds still favor a wider war. I mean, just because, wars are difficult to contain. They create deep passions, they stir up hatred. Those hatreds are really hard to turn off. And even if 6 months from now, Russia were to conquer every last square inch of the Ukraine, you'd have people there very unhappy, crying out for international help. That help would be very hard for NATO to say no to that. NATO would be under great pressure to launch some kind of insurgency, an Afghan-style insurgency, and that would almost surely lead to the war spreading. Because that insurgency would have to be launched from foreign bases, and foreign bases would then become military targets for Russia. Wars tend to spread. That is the nature of wars. So it takes a real effort to prevent that. And NATO and the U.S. show no understanding of that, and they are not making any attempt to rein in passions to contain the fighting. To the contrary, they're flooding the Ukraine with weapons. They're cheering the Ukrainians on. There's intense war fever at home. The media have been mobilized to stir the public up, and so I think that this war will wind up spreading. It took 37 days from the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in late June 1914 for war to break out in early September, and we're now on day 31 of the war in the Ukraine. So we've got 6 days to go, and that pattern. I think that the U.S. will not be able to withstand the pressure to get into the conflict.
I think there is a significant, I do want to get into the Nazis in Ukraine stuff next, but there is one significant difference. And I believe in listening to Scott Ritter and several other experts who said, look, at this point, Russia has escalatory dominance. And one of the issues here is, and here's one of the differences. If NATO was to say, okay, we're going to get involved, and doggone it, we're going to give Russia a bloody nose. The problem is this: Russia's the second most powerful army in the world, right? But Russia's army is not set up to project around the world. It's set to hit you in one place, and that's to protect their border. That if the problem, and NATO knows this, if they were to militarily engage Russia on Russia's border, they would suffer likely a comprehensive defeat, and it wouldn't be a long time happening because of Russia's power. Is the U.S. has the biggest army, but it's spread all over the damn world. Russia has the second biggest and most powerful army, but it's sitting in one place. And Russia and the NATO doesn't really want to engage an army where they're likely to get a defeat, which that's logical. War is not logical. So what are your thoughts on that dynamic being far different from the World War I dynamic and causing NATO to be considerably more hesitant, particularly in light of, looking at the hypersonic missiles and other things?
Yeah, I mean, war's an abyss. And when an abyss opens up, it opens up wider and wider, and it's really hard not to fall into it. I mean, everyone recognizes that going to war in the Ukraine would be insane, but as you say, war is insane, and it's very hard to stay out of it. And of course, if the U.S. were to enter into a war in the Ukraine, that war would not be confined to the Ukraine. It would spill over into Poland and Romania to the west, and into Russia itself in the east. And does the United States really want to fight a war on the Russian steppe? I mean, the prospect is mind-boggling. Does the world really want a second Stalingrad? And that, of course, that's the optimistic view. That assumes that there wouldn't be any use of nuclear weapons. In which case, Stalingrad would seem like a schoolyard fistfight. So the gates of hell have opened up due to the reckless behavior of NATO. I mean, the NATO role is absolutely central to this whole thing, and years from now, when historians, ponder how this debacle occurred, I'm confident that will be a prime area of inquiry.
Yeah, I think that there is a potential for this to spread. I think that we have yet to see. I think there is a potential for it to burn out after when obviously Russia's going to win, and there's a potential for it, but let's face it, the neocons aren't done. They're looking at Asia to stir up bloody hell. This could fizzle out, and these idiots could say, well, here's our perfect time to stir up they're looking towards a sanctions regime against China. They're looking for a far larger. I mean, this could settle out if they engage with China. Taiwan's not the kind of proxy. China would have to be sinking U.S. ships and aircraft carriers, etc., when they engage with Taiwan. So that would be no proxy there. That would be war between China and Russia. And so these idiots, these lunatics, let me put it like this: this ain't the end of it, and it might not be the worst part.
No, this is not the end by any means. I mean, the U.S. just suffered a crushing, humiliating defeat in Afghanistan. And that has led to a profound crisis of confidence in U.S. leadership, which is why Biden is taking a tough stand in the Ukraine. And the U.S. can't stand by and watch Zelensky being defeated. It can't, because that would mean a second Afghan-style defeat, and the U.S. just couldn't stand that. So therefore, if Zelensky is at the point of being defeated, I am pretty confident the U.S. will not leave things well enough alone.
Interesting. I kind of think they will, but we will see. Yeah, that's good. We're having this conversation now. Another big thing that we've got to talk about, and I think this is a factor that can't be overlooked: the effect of the sanctions on the populations of. We can talk about the U.S. I think the bigger thing is the Europeans. They're already starting to take a hit. They're already starting to get restless, and if anything stops or slows this thing up, it would be the Biden's coalition falling apart. And these sanctions, particularly with what's happened with the ruble recently, these sanctions are going to hit the Europeans first and foremost with a devastating blow. And I think politically and socially, Europe is going to be the first place to be destabilized. Your thoughts on that?
Well, whether it's the first place or whether destabilization hits the U.S. first, I don't really know. It doesn't really matter because both of them are going to take a hit. Yeah, I mean, the Europeans and especially the Germans have not started asking the really tough questions, but that's okay because the longer they put off those tough questions, the more forceful those questions will be when they finally arrive and are finally addressed. And the big question is, how the hell did they get in this spot in the first place? I mean, Germany had a perfectly reasonable energy deal with Russia. I mean, there were Nord Stream 1 had been in operation since 2010. The Russians were perfectly fine business partners. They supplied the goods, they took the payment, they fulfilled all their contractual obligations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Nord Stream 2 would presumably have been more of the same and would have meant that Germany's natural gas requirements were set for years to come. And Germany, if it was smart, would have then taken the opportunity to proceed with plans to wean itself off fossil fuels and to eventually, transfer its economy to other kinds of energy sources that do not contribute to global warming, which would lead to a fall in the price of natural gas and a lessening importance of supply lines like Nord Stream 1 and 2. So everything was going along okay. And then the U.S., however, opposed Nord Stream 2 with by all means, at its disposal, and it has finally wound up in throwing, what seems to be and finally wrecking that project. And now Germany is facing a huge energy crunch. It's dependent on liquid natural gas shipments from Texas, which will be, something on the order of 5 times more expensive per unit of energy. Expensive facilities have got to be built for the transshipment of LNG, et cetera. So Germany is facing a huge energy crunch, a huge economic crunch. And the U.S., by the way, is not. The U.S. is since it's an energy exporter, it's actually going to profit to a small degree from the run up in energy prices, which are now at $115 a barrel for the price for crude oil. The U.S. is going to benefit. The U.S. is taking a small number of refugees, leaving it to the Europeans to take in the great mass, which involves real expense. So at some point the Europeans and especially the Germans have got to ask themselves, how did this happen? How did this catastrophe take place? How did we let things get so out of hand? And the answer to that is that U.S. and German interests are at odds with one another. I mean, Germany has every reason to be on friendly business-like terms with Russia, and the U.S. has every reason not to. So essentially, Germany's interests are being sacrificed so the U.S. can fulfill its imperial ambitions. So how long can Germany go on with this? I mean, this is completely insane. And this is something that the German left should be asked. These are questions the German left should be answering in particular, because American imperialism has led that country to a complete dead end. It's led the working class to a dead end. a dead end consisting of inflation and unemployment and factory closings.
But
So
I got to ask you this to add this in the requirement of the Russians that the Germans will have to pay for gas in rubles. Your thoughts on that?
that simply strengthens the ruble and strengthens the Russian economy and probably adds to the real cost of energy. So therefore, Germany winds up paying more, as of course all energy consumers wind up paying more. All energy producers wind up benefiting, including the LNG producers in Texas. This is Ted Cruz, by the way. This is why Ted Cruz opposed opposed Nord Stream 2. I mean, Ted Cruz couldn't give a damn about anything that happens outside Texas, but all he knows is that LNG is good for Texas.
Right.
So anyway, so it drives up energy prices. It strengthens the Russian economy. It undermines the effect of U.S. Sanctions. So it's a no-win, all-lose proposition for the Europeans. And once again, they've got to be asking themselves, how did they get in this mess? And the answer is that by allowing the U.S. to proceed in an increasingly reckless and aggressive manner.
Dan, it seems to me that the U.S., the idea was always to sacrifice Ukraine, to set Ukraine up as this proxy border war and to drag Russia in and to utilize Ukrainian bodies as, to catch bullets, sadly, and horribly. And lots of Ukrainians and Russians will die and we'll let them suffer and we will, quote, benefit. It seems to me that's moved to Germany and the EU when it comes to, we're talking about the kinetic war, but let's talk about the sanctions war. It seems that they're now saying, okay, great, we'll do this sanctions war. We'll benefit making more money off of LNG. Oh, and by the way, the German industry will get wiped out. The people will starve and it'll be some dystopian moonscape. It seems to me now the EU is being treated exactly like Ukraine as a disposable asset.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, that's what empires do. I mean, empires are endlessly arrogant and selfish, and they use allies, and then they toss them away when those allies are no longer of use. So so Germany is being left holding the dirty end of the stick here.
But I suspect come this summer, having watched for many, many years, everything, the uprising, shall we say, rallies, protests in Europe, the Europeans are prone to take to the streets and get angry. I expect with this going on, we're going to see Europe explode into protest and in an instability in an ugly way this summer.
Well, whether it's ugly or progressive, I don't know. I don't want to be pessimistic, but not only Europe. I mean, I expect the whole. I think the Europeans should be asking these questions first and foremost, but so should everybody. I mean, people in the third world being hit with skyrocketing food prices.
Yeah,
they should be asking these questions. Americans should be asking these questions because they'll be facing factory closures and rising gasoline prices. They've got to ask these questions as well. I mean, the crisis is international, and therefore the response must be international. I mean, the working class around the world is just being pummeled, and they should ask themselves, how did the people like Biden lead them into a catastrophe? It's the same thing that happened in 1914, and by 1918, after or 17, after the death of millions of people on the battlefield, these were the questions that workers all over the world were asking.
Well, I have heard it said, hard times are fighting times. So I imagine people will be angry, and this may very well be. Even the CEO of BlackRock said this looks like the death of globalism. So interestingly enough, this is going to force a lot of countries to rethink their global supply chains and start recognizing we better grow our food at home. We better do things at home so we can't get cut off. And so in the long run, if we are all not vaporized in a nuclear war, which I'm crossing my fingers, maybe there'll be a new horizon out of this,
I know. I'm counting on that. Everything I do is predicated on that assumption. But we are facing a time of great danger.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Dan Lazar, author. He's got some great books out, and you can find his writings all over the place. Thanks a lot, Dan. Talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. And now, Dr. Gerald Horne from, I believe, Houston, Texas.
Correct.
Yes, Dr. Gerald Horne. He's an author. He's got like 30 books out there. He's got so many books out there. I can't count that high. I take my shoes off, and I still have more books to count. So, Dr. Horne, we've been talking about the Ukraine crisis, but as a man who has great knowledge of the world, in particular the global South, I'd like to ask you about a few questions about that. And let's start with Africa. One of the things that was pushed very early by the Biden administration was the whole world is behind us, is supporting us. And when I started to read various African newspapers and talk to people who I know are from Africa, I noticed I got a far different response. Your thoughts?
Well, the whole world being with the United States and the North Atlantic countries is obviously an exaggeration. Just a few days ago in the New York Times, an op-ed writer pointed out that of the 10 most populous nations on planet Earth, only one, the United States of America, was endorsing with a full-throated manner the sanctions against Moscow. If you look at the General Assembly vote that sought to censure Russia for this intervention, what's striking is that about 50 nations either abstained or did not participate. And of those 50, a disproportionate number were from the African continent, including South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, etc. Then we know that China is not endorsing the sanctions regime. And in fact, as I've written in blackagendareport.com, I believe, the focus, the target ultimately of this escapade against Russia is ultimately China. That is to say that China is being placed in the position of either A, going along with sanctions, in which case it will be weakening a major ally, or B, not endorsing the sanctions, and then you will have sanctions turned on China itself. Now, of course, the European Union will be key in that process, but given the way that they have been capitulating to Uncle Sam, it's difficult to be optimistic about the Europeans standing up for their own interests. And then there's India. And India, of course, has a relationship to Moscow stretching back to independence of India in 1947, if not before. And what's remarkable there is that as we speak, there are important talks taking place in New Delhi between the Chinese foreign minister and his Indian counterpart. And this is the first high-level meeting of these two nations who have sharp contradictions between them in 4 years. In fact, they had a very sharp clash in the Himalayas just about a year or so ago. And what's remarkable about that meeting is that there's a third party at the table, which is Russia, because Russia is in the catbird seat in terms of having positive relations with both India and China, which you cannot say for the United States of America, which in fact is en route to worsening relations with India by pressuring India and even threatening to sanction India unless India goes along with sanctions, which then leads to what might be one of the most important aspects of this entire crisis, which is de-dollarization. That is to say, the United States has had a kind of privilege in allowing the dollar to be used to settle trade arrangements, even between countries that are not embedded in North America. What you see now with regard to Russia and India is that they are going to be trading in the Indian rupee and the Russian ruble. Likewise, Saudi Arabia, which has a bone to pick with Uncle Sam for various reasons, is offering or is apparently involved in negotiations that will allow it to sell its oil to China and settling that arrangement in Chinese yuan, or renminbi, as it's often called. So Washington, I think, has overestimated its strength. And secondly, it's underestimated the strength of its antagonists, which usually winds up with a nation like the United States having egg on its face, if not worse. And I think part of the problem is that the United States, at least the US ruling class, has been able to roll over domestic opposition, the US left. And that leads to these distorted, warped ventures on planet Earth. They expect other nations to roll over or to be easily traduced as the US left and its purported antagonists are traduced. That is not working out. And so Uncle Sam, whether Uncle Sam recognizes or not, may be on the brink of a world-changing, game-changing venture, which is not the way it intended. And I should also say that with regard to this proposition of the world being united with the United States, it's quite arrogant in the sense that we're really talking about the North Atlantic community, along with nations like Switzerland. We're not talking about the global South, for example. And interestingly enough, the United States, which has this multiracial population, is obviously privileging those of European descent. You saw the announcement about letting 100,000 Ukrainians into the United States at the same time that Haitians are being beaten along the Texas-Mexico border as they struggle to get into the United States of America. You have this spectacle of African students from Nigeria in particular being harassed and persecuted as they sought to escape Ukraine, harassed by the US ally in Poland. Poland, of course, being a major right-wing populist ally of the United States of America, where President Biden will be making a major speech today. He may be speaking at the same time that I'm speaking right now. And this is the kind of white supremacy that apparently has purchase in the North Atlantic bloc, but sinks like a lead balloon in the rest of the world.
Let me ask you about Europe. You and I rarely talk about Europe. This seems to me to be a massive destabilization of Europe on many fronts, certainly not the least of which being economic. I think that's fairly obvious. But here's the other thing. There is a massive flood of literally millions of refugees coming into Europe, and they're Eastern European refugees. And there is some level of prejudice in Western Europe against the Eastern Europeans, number one. You've got Ukrainians, which there is a culture there of, shall we say, there's some issues of Nazism and things of that nature that's flooding out into other parts of Europe. At the same time, Europeans are about to face or in the process of facing devastating inflation increases, food shortages, energy price increases as a result of simply not being willing to sign a paper that said Ukraine's not going into NATO, it's going to stay neutral. It's, some very simple things they could have done to stop that. What are your thoughts about the destabilization of Europe via economic sanctions, energy increases, and, which a lot of people aren't talking about, this massive influx of Ukrainian refugees? And let me add one last thing, being that Ukraine was the poorest country in Europe, many of them are not going to want to go back.
Well, you may know that in his recent memoir, the sacked National Security Advisor under Donald J. Trump, speaking of John Bolton, said that Mr. Trump and those he represents saw the European Union as second only to China as a threat to U.S. hegemony and domination, which makes it all the more curious why the EU, the European Union, a giant with a feet of clay, has really gone along with this latest U.S. escapade. That is to say, it's not only the fact that these millions of refugees will put enormous pressure on the budgets, not only of the member states, but Brussels itself, but it's also the fact that NATO, dominated by the United States of America, is seizing the opportunity to ratchet up tensions on the continent of Europe, which can only redound to the detriment of Europe. And it makes all the more curious this French presidential election, which will be taking place in a few weeks, where President Macron is expected to sail to re-election. But even Jean Mélenchon of France Unbowed, who I must say, before this Ukraine crisis, I had tremendous respect for him and his organization. He's collapsed like a house of cards with regard to the Ukraine crisis, believe it or not. And I know I find it hard to believe. And what that suggests to me are sharp contradictions within the various sectors of the French political spectrum. That is to say that recently, Mr. Macron, as recent as last year, spoke of NATO as being brain dead. Even on the verge of February 24th, 2022, he was speaking of the so-called strategic autonomy of France and the European Union. Many had thought that the WEU, the Western European Union, would be the kernel for a military alternative to the European Union. But I think the problem has been that protestations to the contrary, France is heavily dependent upon US imperialism to maintain its neo-empire in Africa in particular, aerial and satellite assets in particular, dispensed by AFRICOM, the so-called Africa Command. And as a result, you see, once again, France bending the knee to Uncle Sam. And then there's a spectacle of Germany. And one of the most unfortunate aspects of this crisis that will be emerging, I'm afraid to say, is the rearming of Germany. It's pledged to spend 2% plus of its GDP on the military. This will be a shot in the arm to the military industrial complex of the United States of America, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, the former home of Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin in particular. And then there's Great Britain, which is searching for a role in these post-Brexit circumstances and has wound up being one of the more hawkish members of NATO, somehow trying to be more militaristic and bellicose than Uncle Sam himself, which is more than a notion. At the same time, you have Britain still suffering from this COVID epidemic, COVID pandemic. At the same time, you still see on the high streets of London the shuttering of small businesses. And so it seems that what's happening, to look at this from a distance, is that the North Atlantic countries have overestimated their strength, have underestimated the strength of Moscow, have not done an analysis of the correlation of forces globally that takes into account China and India and nations like South Africa, and then other nations, even Brazil, with right-wing Bolsonaro, has been hesitant to endorse the sanctions regime. And as a result, is making a spectacular blunder. That is to say that we may be on the cusp of a new international situation, a new global correlation of forces. And unlike the case for the last few hundred years, instead of the British Empire and its successor across the Atlantic in Washington playing the role of top dog, you will see a constellation of nations led by China, a constellation of nations not only led by China, but which will in a sense receive a coronation this year when the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, meet in China. And therein you begin to see the embryo of a new international situation. And I must say, it could not come a moment too soon.
You know, certainly, I acknowledge that we are at a dangerous time, and that, you know, there is potential for bad things to happen as a result. I think we all must be sober enough to acknowledge that. However, I think we should have also try our best to look at it in a positive light, that We're looking at the rebirth of the world's particular economic and geopolitical landscape and order. That being said, let's just move ahead a little bit and we get through the bumpy times. Let's say because to me, one of the big things is if Russia slash the Russia-Ukraine nations, however that ends up being aligned, gets their wheat going back out, and Africa and South America and the Middle East can get wheat. I think that's a big part of it. That's a big, and fertilizer and things of that nature. Okay. But what comes after that, as we see Russia moving to China's Union Pay card, as we see both Iran and Venezuela saying, you know, we're going to start going with this Russia's Mir card. Isn't there an opportunity for some of these countries in South America, Latin America, even the Middle East to get some independence and to start to grow out from under this world of vicious US dollar sanctions? And maybe there could be a new horizon for these countries to independently grow.
Well, I think that's highly possible because de-dollarization will also put a premium on strategic and essential commodities. That is to say, to the extent that the North Atlantic countries sanction Russia, that means they will not have access to Russian palladium, which is necessary for the green economy, necessary for catalytic converters on automobiles, which then puts a premium on South African palladium. Likewise, gold, to the extent that you have de-dollarization and to the extent that the Chinese currency is not convertible, which it is not, then this will put a premium on gold, for example. And to the extent that Russian gold is sanctioned, that puts a premium on South African gold. To the extent that uranium becomes more important as the North Atlantic countries break their anti-nuclear vows and pledges, this will put a premium on uranium coming from Namibia, South Africa's northern neighbor. To the extent that Russian energy is sanctioned, and of course, that's not going to be easy, particularly since Moscow has announced that Russian energy should be purchased by these unfriendly countries, mostly meaning European countries with Russian rubles. But in any case, let's say that the Germans can come up with Russian rubles. They may decide that they do not want to deal with Russian oil and natural gas, which puts a premium on oil from Angola and Southwest Africa, Namibia's northern neighbor, or oil from Nigeria due north of Angola, not to mention natural gas from Algeria, which is already being pumped into Europe, and natural gas somehow getting from Nigeria to Western Europe. Now, the sound you may hear in the background as I speak to you from Texas is the sound of corks on champagne bottles popping as those captains of industry in what is called the Petro Metro, speaking of the Houston area, are celebrating. They're dancing in the streets. I should turn my camera around. You can see them literally dancing in the streets over the prospect of selling Texas and Louisiana natural gas and oil into Europe. The problem there is, as the head of Tellurian, one of the major beneficiaries of this new regime that Mr. Biden is seeking to impose, he has said, quoted all over the place in the financial press, that there is not necessarily the shipping ability nor the receiving ability in Europe to receive liquefied natural gas. So Europe may be freezing in the dark as this spring begins to recede, and followed, as you know, by summer, fall, and then winter. So I think, once again, I think that the North Atlantic countries have not thought through the circumstances, which is even more curious because supposedly at a place like Yale, they teach grand strategy, where you're supposed to think of the world like a grand chess match, or like Zbigniew Brzezinski, the late national security advisor under Jimmy Carter once put it in his final book, The Grand Chessboard, where you're not only supposed to think of the immediate circumstance of ensnaring Russia in a conflict with Ukraine, you're supposed to plot out and game out the ultimate consequences. Obviously, they have not done so. Obviously, they have forfeited their ability to rule and administer this state. The tragedy is that some of us, including myself, I'm afraid to say, are stuck on this ship of fools as it's headed directly to an iceberg.
Another important part of the world that you and I rarely talk about, and I think it's important, I'd like to get your thoughts on the Middle East. We see that Bashar al-Assad has visited the UAE, much to the chagrin of Joe Biden and the neocons, implying that there will be some manner of détente between the major factions of the Sunni Shiite split, that there's certainly leaves an opportunity for him to act as a middleman to maybe start to bring some closure to the Yemen conflict, and this is important in talking to my particular contact, a friend who's in Beirut, a journalist named Latham Aroof that I regularly talk to, and that is that the man and woman on the street in the Arab world are very touched by, and I say this in an angry kind of way, by what's going on in Europe, in that they see that the Muslim refugees have been rejected. Muslims have been, pushed back, have been told, we don't want you here. After NATO and the US destabilizes their, Syria, Afghanistan, etc., Muslim refugees show up because of their destabilization, and they reject them and they don't like them. And the Ukrainian refugees, the statements that are being made, they're blonde haired, they're blue eyed, they're Christian like us, etc. So in the Middle East, that alone has caused an uproar. How does the Middle East react to this? What are the dynamics of the Middle East in this reorder of things, shall we say?
Well, as the billionaire Warren Buffett often says, you don't realize who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. And what this crisis is revealing, if you talk to a screenplay writer, to use another metaphor, they often tell you that a device they use in crafting an excellent screenplay that leads to a movie is this notion that pressure reveals character. And the pressure of this crisis is revealing the character of the international situation, not only with regard to this rather brutal and naked white supremacy that you've reflected in your castigation of how the Europeans are treating refugees from Ukraine versus refugees from West Asia and from North Africa, with many of the latter drowning in the seas of the Mediterranean, even as we speak. But it's also revealing something that the US mainstream press has not commented on, interestingly enough, which is that, as I've said before, there's been remarkable unity in the pan-European world, from Ukraine on the east, across Europe to Ottawa and Washington. Also, I should say, incorporating thus far Japan and South Korea, but I expect those nations to be peeled off sooner rather than later. Watch their foreign relations, particularly given the election of the hawkish leader, President Yoon in South Korea, under pressure from North Korea, which has just launched an intercontinental ballistic missile that fell and splashed into the waters off the coast of Japan. So given the pressure from both China and North Korea, I expect the South Koreans and the Japanese to fold, not to mention the pressure from Vladivostok on Russia's Pacific coast. But it's also interesting that the press has not commented on the position of Israel in this crisis. Israel, which has been accepted into the pan-European community for whatever reason, it even participates, as you know, in the Eurovision Song Contest, which unites Europeans across borders. It oftentimes caucuses with the Europeans at the United Nations in New York, but they're trying to be neutral. And as the State Department has said, echoing the song from the Kentucky coal mines. There are no neutrals here. There's no neutrality in this struggle. And yet Israel is posturing as a neutral. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett offering his good offices as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. Thus far, that has been accepted rather blandly by Washington. But as this crisis escalates, believe it or not, we may see, I find it difficult to even mouth these words, criticisms of Israel from the corporate suites and from the corridors of power in the United States of America, as strange as that may sound. But I think that Israel is reflecting the posture of its neighbors, some of whom were yoked into these so-called Abraham Accords, speaking of the accords negotiated by President Trump, which involved a kind of de facto recognition of Israel by Morocco, Bahrain, etc. And of course, Morocco, which bills itself as one of the United States' most long-standing allies, stretching back to the 18th century, has not endorsed sanctions against Russia. And we've already talked about Saudi Arabia, for example. And I dare say that Qatar, which one of these Persian Gulf monarchies, which will probably benefit from the shift away from natural gas from Russia, since it exports natural gas, and of course it sponsors and hosts Al Jazeera, the worldwide communications network. Al Jazeera has tried to posture as a quasi-European propaganda arm some of those rather distasteful statements that you have cited concerning how the Ukraine crisis is different because the refugees are Christian and blonde and blue-eyed. You have that same sort of nonsense coming from Al Jazeera, believe it or not. I don't think that that's sustainable. I think Al Jazeera is going to come under enormous pressure. And it will particularly come under pressure because, once again, you see that Washington is scrambling to improve relations with Venezuela to make up the shortfall with regard to Russian oil. They're trying to finally dot the I's and cross the T's around the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, the anti-nuclear accord with Iran, which will allow more Iranian oil to flow into North Atlantic countries. But at the same time, that empowering of Iran, as the Israeli propagandists in this country have suggested, will empower Iran to put more pressure on Israel, put more pressure on Qatar. And once again, we see that a new international situation is developing with consequences that were unimaginable as recently as 5 weeks ago, and also helping to expose and reveal the character of the national security state headquartered in Washington, which obviously was not able to game out these consequences, which are so readily visible as we speak.
Dr. Horn, I know we're running a bit over, but I do have something else important that I'd like to get your comment on, because you have studied, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Paul Robeson, etc. And one thing I found in watching them over the long run was at some point they all got angry with the white liberal class at some point, some far earlier than others. And this is why I think this is of consequence, and I want to get your comment on it. For the last X amount of years, 4 years, we heard Trump is a Nazi, Charlottesville, we hate Nazis. And now this same liberal punch a Nazi class is hug a Nazi in Ukraine, showing hypocrisy there. We've got on our Black Lives Matter mask, and we've got our rainbow flag because we believe that everybody should be treated fairly. But this, I don't know if the term is racism or whatever, that we're seeing not towards the Russian military or the Russian leadership, but against people who are ethnically Russian. You are just ethnic. They just haven't called for putting them in concentration camps yet. The idea that you are ethnically Russian, therefore you can't sing at an opera, you can't play a sport, you can't direct an orchestra. These are things that are part of the culture. One of the basketball players, I think his name is Dragic, was booed at a basketball game. The man's a basketball, but he's ethnically Russian. Your thought on the white liberal class that were these Pelosi and these people were taking a knee from George Floyd with a dashiki cloth or whatever, all of these things that they do, but then to be revealed to be capable of this kind of, and I'm just going to use the word, I guess, and make Russians honorary people of color or honorary black people for this particular discussion, this level of racism from this white liberal. Oh, lastly, because we've been talking about it, these statements that we've been hearing about, well, these people have blonde hair and blue eyes and they're Christians and law like this, doesn't it break your heart, has been on CNN and MSNBC and the so-called what was said to be the liberal and free-thinking media. Your thoughts on these dynamics?
Well, obviously, we should draw reasonable inferences from this scandal. That is to say that these constitutional liberties, which we have been taught, we have been instructed, are sacrosanct. They are sacrosanct until they're not. And that is to say that it's difficult to take these constitutional liberties seriously when they can be suspended or thrown overboard at the snap of a finger, which has basically happened. It's in some ways worse than your colorful description depicted. What I mean is you've seen the attempt to revoke the ability of the music of Tchaikovsky, the Russian composer, who's been dead for about 2 centuries, to be played in the North Atlantic community. You've seen the attempt to revoke the hallowed status of the Russian novelist Dostoevsky, who has been long gone since the 19th century. And so what we should draw from this is that the sacred Constitution, the sacred Bill of Rights, so-called, it's basically an empty vessel that can be suspended willy-nilly. Now, of course, some of us have known this for some time. At the same time that Thomas Jefferson was prating and prattling about all men are created equal, he, of course, was presiding over a plantation administered in a brutal manner by enslaved Africans. He saw no contradiction with regard to that particular contradiction. And that mentioned the fact of birthing children with an enslaved woman of African descent who happened to be a teenager. I mean, if we were to talk about that today, we'd hang him up from his thumbs for being a child molester and a sexual predator and sexual abuser. So once again, I think, as the screenplay writers tell us, a pressure reveals character. Pressure of this intervention in Ukraine and the fact that the North Atlantic countries are pouring an arsenal into Ukraine, that's revealing the character of capitalism, is revealing the character of US imperialism. And what we are seeing now is the ugly visage of capitalism and US imperialism, and the fact that you have descendants of enslaved Africans discussing this in 2022 is only further evidence of what I speak.
Thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne has a number of books out. You can go online anywhere that books are found, and you can check them out. My particular favorite one, of course, for obvious reasons, is your Paul Robeson. What's the name of your book on Paul Robeson, Dr. Horne?
Paul Robeson, The Artist is Revolutionary.
All right. Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate you taking out your Saturday morning to spend some time with us, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you very much for taking your time out. Also, make sure you smash that like button so well, I would like to hope that we will get moved up, but we're probably facing some level of shadow banning also. But we had Regis Tremblay, we had Dan Lazar, and of course the one and only Dr. Gerald Horne. Do me a favor, if you would be so kind as to, if you're watching this on Twitter, go to my YouTube show and make sure you subscribe and make sure you like and share it. Share this on all your social media platforms. I am now on Odyssey. That's interesting. So I haven't broadcast. I haven't learned anything about broadcasting on Odyssey. That should be soon. What's interesting is I found out that Odyssey, once you join, goes to YouTube, and it'll bring all your YouTube videos to Odyssey in case they shut you off, which, let's face it, that could happen. But it was great. Yes. So let's see what, before we go, Black Parsons says, Garland had an all-star lineup this morning. Thank you. And you are part of it. Tom Colby says, you might not be able to even say the word rushing soon, as it might upset those that think about Russians. Let's see what we got here. We've got Saul Good says, the Jefferson family still won't allow their Black family members to be buried in the family graveyard today. Well, there's probably so many of them out there, there wouldn't be much room left on the family graveyard. How about that? Guess what? Most Jews in Ukraine were seen as not racially pure, dark-skinned, dark-eyed. Coop W says, something's floating in the bowl will eventually sink to the bottom given enough time. Perhaps similar to the Ukraine attitude toward the Poles or World War II and their enthusiastic participation in the gassing of Poles during the war. One thing that I think is important before I leave, and that is one of the things that has been coming out of this conflict is people being able to look at World War II to recognize that there was a significant class of Nazi collaborators in Eastern Europe, that a number of those collaborators after the war, after World War II, when the Nazis were beaten back in Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union, a number of those collaborators were brought to the United States to escape justice, which in their cases would have been a rope around their neck, and the other end over an oak tree in all likelihood, but for the dastardly deeds they were involved in. So these Nazi collaborators were oftentimes brought to the US and Canada and to the Western Hemisphere to escape justice. Oftentimes they were integrated into the US system and the Canadian system. We see now, Chrystia Freeland, whatever her name is, Deputy Prime Minister. And if you trace her roots, you won't go far up the tree before Nazis start showing up. And her grandfather was a Nazi in Eastern Europe. We see that the Nazis in Ukraine, they were technically, numerically, a small percentage of Ukraine, a small percentage of the Ukrainians, but they were empowered. Their power didn't come from Ukraine. They were empowered by the US, Canada, and NATO. Their power came from here. So much so that they began teaching their Nazi ideology to children in schools, things of that nature. And we see that most of the US's allies in the Eastern European nations, you look at the Baltic states and etc., and many of our allies trace their political legacy back to those same Nazi collaborator groups and organizations in World War II. And that's unseemly, to say the least. And at least I think that's one of the things that's coming out of it. Coming out of this, people are learning about that and learning about the connection. So thank you very much. We talked a lot about the Ukraine crisis. Don't forget, I try to be here every Saturday morning with some great guests, and I hope you're here too. Thanks a lot, and we will talk to you soon. Or not we, I will talk to you soon, and we'll hang out with each other again. I might be on later on tonight, but I try to get on pretty much every day.